July 25th, 1944, St. Lo, Normandy, France. 2,430 American heavy bombers have just finished. Now the artillery begins, and what follows is something the German army has never experienced in 5 years of war. At 1100 hours on July 25th, 1944, the day that Operation Cobra begins, approximately 1,000 pieces of American artillery opened fire simultaneously on a section of the German front line approximately 7 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers deep. The guns do not fire in sequence or in rolling waves or in the careful battery by battery choreography that German artillery doctrine prescribes for a preparatory bombardment. They fire together in a coordinated mass that has been directed by a fire control system that has no equivalent in the German army and no precedent in the history of artillery as a military discipline. A system that has, in the weeks preceding Cobra, registered every battery's position with the mathematical precision required for predicted fire, established the communications networks that allow simultaneous direction of every battery to the same target complex, and trained the observers moving with the leading infantry to call fire missions in a format and at a speed that the fire direction centers can process without delay. The architecture of the American artillery system is not visible in the number of rounds falling on the German position, though the number is large enough to transform the landscape. It is visible in the silence that preceded it. The German forward positions received no warning, heard no registration rounds, experienced no preliminary ranging that would have allowed an experienced soldier to assess the incoming pattern and take protective action. The artillery preparation of July 25th arrives as a fact accomplished, not as a sequence of events that a trained soldier can interpret and respond to. It is the difference between a storm that builds and a storm that is suddenly complete. The ground under the German 84th Corps positions does not shake in the way that artillery barrages shake ground, rhythmically, with intervals between salvos that allow a man to breathe and assess and move. It convulses continuously, as though something beneath the earth's surface is attempting to tear it apart from below. Men who survived the preparatory fires and the subsequent American ground assault described the experience in their post-battle depositions and in the post-war interviews conducted by American military historians, in language that consistently reaches for comparisons outside their direct military experience, a natural disaster, an industrial catastrophe, something beyond the category of weapons fire that the human nervous system can process as manageable, because the sounds and pressures that categorize manageable incoming artillery, the whistle of individual shells, the intervals between impacts, the ability to hear the next round coming, are entirely absent. There is no next round coming. There is only a continuous state of impact. The German army had been fighting since 1939. It had fought through every artillery system that every major power had brought against it, from Poland to France to the Soviet Union to North Africa. Nothing had prepared its soldiers for what the American artillery system could produce, and the specific reason for this, the reason that German generals consistently identified in their post-war assessments as the quality that made American artillery categorically different from anything their training or experience had given them a framework for, was not the number of guns the Americans had, though the numbers were extraordinary. It was what the Americans had built around those guns, a fire control system that made every gun in an entire corps available to any artillery observer in that corps within minutes, a mathematical and communications achievement that transformed the function of field artillery from a massed weapon into a precision one, from a destructive area tool into a responsive command instrument, and from the supporting arm that every military tradition had always treated as second to the maneuver forces it supported into the most decisive single weapon on the European battlefield of 1944 and 1945, to understand why the American artillery fire control system was, in the judgment of German commanders who had spent their careers studying and experiencing artillery at the highest professional level, something that no training in the world could prepare you for. You have to understand what artillery was supposed to do before the Americans rebuilt the concept. Artillery in 1940 and 1941, in the German conception and in most European military tradition, was a supporting arm. It prepared the ground for infantry and armor by destroying or suppressing the defensive positions that would otherwise stop the advance. It was massed for specific missions and then distributed battery by battery to the units that needed it most. The fire control system that governed this process was hierarchical. A battalion commander needed fire, requested it from the regiment requested it from the division allocated it from what the corps had available, and the corps coordinated with adjacent corps through the army. At each level, the request was processed, verified, prioritized against competing demands, and eventually either approved and directed or denied. The minimum time from a forward observer's identification of a target to the first round falling on it in the German system was several minutes under ideal conditions and considerably longer under the combat conditions it actually obtained. In the system that American artillery doctrine had developed, built on the M101 Fire Direction Center, on the wire and radio communications networks that American engineer units had learned to construct and maintain under combat conditions, and on the training of forward observers who had been taught a fire request procedure that compressed the time from observation to impact to the absolute minimum that the physics of gunnery allowed. The minimum time was under 2 minutes, and the rounds that arrived in those 2 minutes were not from a single battery allocated to the requesting unit. They were from every battery within range, which, in the specific conditions of a corps-level American operation in 1944, could mean 60 or 80 or 100 guns arriving simultaneously on a target that a single observer with a radio had identified 60 seconds earlier. The Germans had no framework for this. Their doctrine had not anticipated it. Their training had not simulated it. And in the fields of Normandy in the summer of 1944, they began paying for the gap between what their doctrine had prepared them for and what the American artillery system could actually do. The development of the American fire control system was not an accident or an improvisation. It was the product of a deliberate institutional decision made at the United States Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the years between the wars, to solve the specific problem that had defined artillery support in the First World War: the inability to mass fire quickly enough to be responsive to the rapidly changing situations of modern combat. The First World War's artillery legacy was one of massive destructive capacity combined with profound tactical inflexibility. An artillery arm that could destroy square miles of landscape in preparation for an assault, but that could not respond quickly enough to the unexpected defensive positions, the new machine gun nests, the artillery concentrations that appeared in the hours after the assault began to stop the infantry that the preparatory fires had been designed to protect. The problem was not the guns. The problem was the time it took to direct them, the gap between a company commander's discovery of a new threat and the moment the first artillery round fell on it, a gap that the First World War's communications technology and fire request procedures had measured in tens of minutes, and that the changing tactical situations of the Western Front had made those tens of minutes fatal to 1,000 separate infantry assaults that were stopped by a machine gun position that had survived the bombardment or had been moved into place after it ended. The men at Fort Sill in the 1920s and 1930s, who had studied this problem, who had gone through the gunnery mathematics and the communications procedures and the forward observer training with the specific question of how to compress the time interval from observation to impact, had arrived at a set of solutions that, taken together, produced the Fire Direction Center as an institution a centralized node that could receive observations from multiple observers simultaneously, compute firing data for multiple batteries simultaneously using pre-computed mathematical tables that reduce the calculation to minutes rather than the hours that full ballistic computation required, and transmit those firing data by radio and wire to the batteries that needed to execute them, all within a time envelope that made the resulting fires relevant to the tactical situation that had prompted them, rather than to the tactical situation that had existed 3 or 4 or 6 minutes earlier when the process began. The solution, developed by a generation of artillery officers that included men who would go on to command at corps and army level in the Second World War. General Leslie McNair, who commanded Army ground forces and who was killed by a short round in the Cobra bombardment he had come to observe. General Omar Bradley, who, as an artillery officer, had studied the First World War's failures in artillery coordination with a systematic rigor that his subsequent command career would apply, was the Fire Direction Center, a centralized mathematical and communications node that could receive, compute, and transmit firing data to multiple batteries simultaneously, allowing massed fires to be directed with the speed of a single battery response. The Fire Direction Center was staffed by officers and NCOs who had been trained at Fort Sill in a curriculum that treated the mathematics of ballistics and the management of fire missions as a single integrated discipline, who had practiced the system until the procedures were reflexive rather than deliberate, and who had been told by a doctrine that the Army's artillery branch had been refining for 15 years, that the measure of an artillery unit was not how accurately it placed individual rounds on individual targets, the German standard, which produced extraordinary individual battery proficiency, but how quickly and accurately it could place the rounds of an entire division or corps on a target that a single observer had identified. Accuracy was necessary. Speed was sufficient. Together, they were decisive. July 25, 1944. The first day of Operation Cobra. The American attack follows the aerial bombardment with a ground assault by 7th Corps under General J. Lawton Collins, the 1st Infantry Division, the 4th Infantry Division, the 30th Infantry Division, and the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, on a front of approximately 7 kilometers. The artillery preparation is not a preliminary bombardment in the traditional sense. It is the opening phase of a fire support plan that continues through the ground assault, adjusts as the assault develops, and responds to the forward observers moving with the leading infantry with a speed that the surviving German defenders describe in their interrogation reports as disorienting. A German platoon that attempts to reorganize in a position its survivors have reached after the bombardment comes under fire from a radio request that reaches the Fire Direction Center within 90 seconds of the observer's identification. An observer who has moved forward with the lead infantry battalion and who is close enough to the reorganizing German platoon to observe it directly through binoculars rather than through artillery observation posts in fixed positions, and produces rounds from 6 batteries arriving in under 2 minutes. The platoon has been given 90 seconds to reorganize after surviving the preparatory fires. 90 seconds is not enough time to establish a defensive position. It is barely enough time to assess casualties and establish communication with adjacent units. When the fire arrives, the platoon is in the worst possible condition to receive it, assembled in a position that has not been improved with overhead cover, without the foxholes, whose construction takes 30 minutes minimum, without the mutual supporting arrangements that a defensive position requires before it can function as one. The fire that arrives has not been adjusted to them. It has been fired with predicted data from a gun target line that the Fire Direction Center computed before the first round was fired, using corrections for atmospheric conditions and ammunition lot variations that the American system tabulates and applies automatically, and it has arrived within the target area with a precision that makes the first volley a fire for effect rather than a ranging sequence. The German survivors of this engagement, interviewed by American intelligence officers in the days following the ECD's Cobra breakout, described the experience not as a continuation of the preparatory bombardment, but as something qualitatively different, a pursuit by fire that followed them from position to position as though the American observer had anticipated their route of withdrawal before they had determined it themselves. The platoon does not have time to reorganize. The next platoon that attempts to establish a defensive position in the same general area comes under fire 30 seconds after occupying it, because the forward observer has been moving with the infantry and is close enough to the German position to identify it as occupied before the Germans have completed their movement into it. The fire that arrives on that position is not a registration round followed by adjustments. It is a fire for effect from the first round, because the American fire direction system uses mathematical modeling of the terrain and the gun positions that allows the first rounds to land within the target area with a probability high enough that adjustment is often unnecessary. The German soldiers in those positions have been hit by artillery all their military lives. They know artillery. They know how to move when fire arrives, how to use the intervals between salvos, how to survive a bombardment and fight through it. What they do not know, and what July 25th is teaching them, is how to survive artillery that has no intervals, fire that arrives before the defensive movement prompted by the previous fire has been completed, fire that follows them from position to position, fire that seems to know where they are going before they get there, because the observer following the American infantry has identified where they are going and has called the fire before their movement is complete. They do not know this because nothing in their training has described it. Their training was built on the assumption that artillery, however intensive, operates within a temporal framework that allows the trained soldier to manage his exposure. American artillery, in the summer of 1944, does not operate within that framework. The specific moment that reveals most completely how the American fire control system differs from anything the German army has encountered, and that produces the assessments that German commanders will repeat in their post-war interviews with a consistency that speaks to the shared experience of a specific shock, is not Cobra itself, but the fighting at Saint-Lô in the weeks preceding it, and specifically the engagement at Hill 192 on July 11, 1944. The 2nd Infantry Division under Major General Walter Robertson attacks Hill 192, the high ground southwest of Saint-Lô that commands observation over the German defensive positions across the entire sector, and that the German command has identified as the terrain feature whose loss would compromise their ability to defend Saint-Lô itself. The German defenders of Hill 192 are from the 3rd Parachute Division, Fallschirmjäger, among the most capable infantry in the German army, men trained to fight without artillery support, and who therefore understand from their own doctrine that the importance of position and initiative exceeds the importance of supporting fires. They have held Hill 192 for weeks against American attacks that have been costly and inconclusive. They hold it because their training and their doctrine and their experience tell them it can be held by men who know how to use the terrain and who are willing to fight at the intensity the terrain requires. On July 11th, the 38th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Ralph Zwicker attacks Hill 192 with fire support from the 2nd Infantry Division's organic artillery, approximately 70 guns, plus the Corps' general support artillery, which Colonel Ralph Zwicker's fire support coordinator has arranged to be available on call. The attack begins at 0600. By 1400, Hill 192 is in American hands. The 3rd Parachute Division's regiments that have held it for weeks have been driven off in 8 hours of fighting, in which the artillery response to any German defensive action, any attempt to move reserves into the threatened sector, any attempt to organize a counterattack, Any attempt to occupy a secondary defensive position arrives so quickly and so massively that the defensive actions cannot be completed before the fire disrupts them. A German commander who calls for reserves finds that the reserves are being fired on before they can depart their assembly area because the observer who has identified the assembly area has called the fire within 60 seconds of the identification, and the fire has arrived within 2 minutes. The German response to this is not deficient courage or deficient tactical skill. It is the recognition that the window of opportunity that a artillery fire normally creates, the interval between the fire and its adjustment that allows an experienced soldier to move, does not exist. The near failure in the American fire support system, the moment that comes closest to demonstrating the limits of even the most advanced artillery doctrine, arrives not in the Normandy campaign, but in the Hürtgen forest in November and December of 1944, where the dense conifer terrain that makes the Hürtgen so costly for American infantry also makes the American artillery system's most critical element dysfunctional. The forward observer cannot see. The ability of the fire direction center to mass fires on a called target depends on the ability of the forward observer to identify the target, describe its location with sufficient precision for the mathematical fire direction system to compute the firing data, and provide adjustment after the first rounds fall if adjustment is needed. In the Hürtgen, the trees that the German defenders have used for 3 months to construct fields of fire that are invisible from above until the American infantryman is inside them also prevent the American observer from seeing the target he needs to call. The shells that the German artillery fires in the Hürtgen burst in the tree crowns rather than on the ground, sending fragmentation downward into the foxholes that would have provided protection from ground bursts. American artillery, which fires on called targets rather than area fires, cannot replicate this effect deliberately, and the German defenders who have been positioned in fighting holes that the tree cover makes invisible from the air and difficult to observe, even from close-in ground positions, are harder to bring under accurate fire than any German position that the American artillery system has encountered since Normandy. The Hürtgen is the place where the American artillery system's dependence on observation meets terrain specifically designed to defeat observation, and the cost of that encounter is measured in the 24,000 American casualties that the Hürtgen Forest Campaign produces between September and December of 1944. Casualties that accumulate because the specific advantage that American artillery provides in open terrain, the ability to suppress a defensive position within minutes of its discovery, is significantly degraded in terrain where positions are not discovered until the attacking infantry is already inside the minimum safe distance for the artillery they are trying to call. A forward observer who cannot see the enemy position cannot call accurate fire. A forward observer who is 20 meters from the position he wants to destroy cannot call fire on it at all without endangering the men he is moving with. In the Hürtgen, American infantry attacks positions it cannot see until it is within the positions, and by that point, the artillery that has been making the American army so dominant in open terrain is a liability rather than an asset. The lesson that the Hürtgen teaches the American army about the limits of its artillery doctrine is a lesson the army absorbs and attempts to correct through additional training in the use of time delay fuses that allow shells to penetrate the tree canopy before detonating, and through better use of smoke and white phosphorus to develop targets before calling high explosive fires. The corrections help at the margin. They do not solve the fundamental problem, which is that the American artillery system's most powerful quality, the ability to produce overwhelming fire on an identified target within minutes, is only as powerful as the ability to identify the target, and the Hürtgen is a forest whose specific military purpose is to make identification impossible until it is too late. But even in the Hürtgen, the fire direction center is calling and mass firing on every target that is identified. A achieving in minutes what German artillery doctrine would have required hours to produce. And the German defenders in the Hurtgen, who survived the campaign, described the artillery they experienced there, the less effective American artillery, in conditions specifically designed to defeat it, as more intensive and more responsive than anything they have encountered on any other front. By the end of the European War in May 1945, the American artillery system has fired approximately 7.2 million artillery rounds in the European theater, an average of approximately 12,000 rounds per day across every day of combat operations. From the Normandy landing to the German surrender, this figure represents not the output of an army with more guns than anyone else, though the numbers are large, and the United States had approximately 5,400 divisional and corps artillery pieces in the European theater by the spring of 1945, comparable in total number to what the Soviet and German armies had deployed on fronts 4 to 5 times as long. But the output of an army that had built a system around those guns that extracted a higher volume of useful fire from each gun in a given period than any other artillery system of the war was capable of producing. The Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front fired more total rounds than the American artillery in the West, but did so through mass, by concentrating guns at ratios that German commanders on the Eastern Front described as overwhelming, and that produced their effects through sheer volume rather than through the specific responsiveness that made the American system qualitatively different. The German artillery, which had been the most technically proficient artillery arm of 1939 and 1940, fired fewer rounds against American forces in the West than the Americans fired against German forces because the German supply situation could not sustain the volume the American system produced, but its individual battery proficiency remained high until the end of the war. Neither the Soviet mass nor the German individual proficiency replicated the specific quality that the American system had built, the ability to produce overwhelming massed fires on a specific target within the time window that made those fires relevant to the tactical situation that had called for them. It represents the output of an army that had built a system around those guns that extracted a higher volume of useful fire from each gun in a given period than any other artillery system of the war was capable of producing. A German artillery battery producing the same number of rounds per day as an American battery was a battery whose rounds were landing on targets that a hierarchical fire request process had required several minutes to approve and direct. An American battery producing the same number of rounds was producing them on targets that had been identified 60 seconds earlier, and whose location had been computed and transmitted in the subsequent 90 seconds. The difference is not in the shells. It is in the time between the moment a target is identified and the moment it ceases to exist as a functioning military position. And in that time gap, in the specific reduction of that interval from minutes to seconds that the American fire control system achieved, lies the entire explanation for why German commanders consistently described American artillery as something no training could prepare you for. Their training had prepared them for artillery that operated within the time constraints that allowed trained soldiers to manage their exposure. American artillery did not operate within those constraints. It operated within a different set of constraints entirely. The constraints of what radio communications, mathematical fire direction, and the systematic training of observers who had been taught to call fires with the speed and precision the system required could actually achieve. And those constraints were ones that the German army's experience of artillery had never described, and its training had never anticipated. The German generals who were interviewed by American military historians in 1945 and 1946 returned to this subject again and again in terms that reveal the genuine professional shock that the American artillery system had produced. General Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer Lehr Division through the Normandy campaign and the subsequent operations in France, and who had served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa, and was therefore as experienced in the relationship between artillery and armored operations, in the tactical coordination of all arms combat, as any German officer alive in 1944 described American artillery in his post-war interview with the Army Historical Division as the single most effective weapon he had encountered in the war, not in any single campaign, not in any specific engagement, but in the entire 5 years of his combat experience from the beginning of the war to the end. He was asked to be specific about what quality he meant. He said, the speed of response. He said that in North Africa, where British artillery had been the primary threat to his armor, the British guns were accurate and numerous and professionally served, but that a formation could take position and have time, measured in minutes rather than seconds, to establish itself before fire arrived. He said that against American artillery in Normandy, the time to establish a position before fire arrived was not minutes, but seconds, and that no formation he commanded was capable of completing the organizational tasks a military position required in seconds, not the Sherman tank, which he considered individually inferior to German armor, not American air power, which he credited as decisive when the weather allowed its employment. American artillery, specifically because of its responsiveness, the specific quality of a system that could produce massed fire on a target within minutes of its identification, rather than the sequential battery fires that German artillery doctrine produced in comparable times. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, who commanded the 47th Panzer Corps at Bastogne, and whose assessment of the American defense of that town became one of the most frequently cited accounts of the campaign, identifies in his post-war interview the fire support coordination of the 101st Airborne's defense as the factor he found most difficult to overcome, not the courage of the American paratroopers, whose courage he acknowledges without qualification, but the fire control system that made the artillery resources of the entire Corps available to the defenders of Bastogne, despite their encirclement and despite their supply shortage, because the fire direction network had been established before the encirclement and continued to function within it, and because the observers with the forward positions had been trained to use it with a speed and precision that produced artillery effects on his attacking infantry before those infantry could organize and execute the attacks they were attempting to make. The artillery didn't just stop the attacks, it stopped the preparation for the attacks. A German commander organizing an assault at Bastogne in December 1944 is a commander whose assembly area is under fire from the moment it is identified by an observer inside the Bastogne perimeter, whose approach routes are being engaged before his formation has completed its movement to the line of departure, and whose assault, if it reaches the defensive wire, arrives there having absorbed fire for the entirety of its approach without the covering fire and suppression that German assault doctrine requires to allow the attacking infantry to close with the defender. The fire direction centers inside the Bastogne perimeter are coordinating with artillery positioned around the perimeter's circumference, processing fire missions from observers at every point on the defensive line simultaneously, and producing fires with a speed that makes the German assault planning cycle, the time from the decision to attack to the execution of the assault, a period during which American artillery is already working on every element of the attack that its observers can identify, and that, in von Luttwitz's professional judgment, was something he had not experienced in any previous campaign and had no framework to counter. You cannot design a tactical plan that accounts for artillery response in under 2 minutes to every observable element of its preparation. You cannot train soldiers to move fast enough to preclude the observation and adjustment cycle that 2 minutes represents. You can only accept the fire and attempt to continue despite it, at costs that compound with each successive attempt, which is exactly what the German forces at Bastogne did, and which is the reason the casualty exchange at Bastogne ran so unfavorably for the attackers. The legacy of what the American artillery system demonstrated in the European theater of the Second World War extends beyond the specific battles where its effects were most visible. It defined the subsequent development of artillery doctrine in every major military for the decades that followed. The Fire Direction Center became the standard model for artillery coordination in NATO and in the armies that its members trained. The principle of observer-directed massed fires became the baseline from which subsequent improvements measured themselves, and the specific proposition that the American system had demonstrated that the decisive quality of an artillery system is the interval between target identification and target suppression, not the individual accuracy of any single battery, became the organizing principle of every artillery modernization program that post-war military analysis produced. The German army had been, in 1939 and 1940, the finest artillery arm in the world by the standards that the world had developed for measuring artillery effectiveness. Individual battery proficiency, rate of fire per gun, accuracy of observed fire at standard combat ranges. By 1944, it was encountering an artillery system that had been built on different standards, that measured effectiveness not per battery, but per observer, not by rounds per gun, but by time per target, not by accuracy under ideal conditions, but by responsiveness under combat conditions. And that had, by those standards, produced a capability that German professional experience had not anticipated was achievable, and that German training had not prepared German soldiers to survive. The general said no training in the world could prepare you for it. They were right. The training that would have prepared a soldier for American artillery in 1944 was the training that would have required him to understand, before he first experienced it, that a weapon system could operate within a time constraint so compressed that the behavioral adaptations his experience had taught him, take cover when you hear the round coming, move between salvos, use the intervals, were not applicable. No training prepares you for the elimination of the interval. That requires experience. And the men who had that experience, who learned in the fields of Normandy and the forests of Germany and the towns of the Rhineland what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a system that had no interval, did not have the opportunity to apply what they had learned.